Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Chekai, managing editor at MEI. Lebanon's presidency and government came into office at the start of this year with high expectations and a long list of urgent but difficult tasks. Yet as Israel strikes against Hezbollah targets in southern Beirut on June 6 dramatically demonstrated, the Lebanese authorities still face a long road ahead to reasserting Lebanon's sovereignty and improving relations with its neighbors, all the while moving forward on much-needed reforms and reconstruction efforts. To discuss Lebanon's pivotal moment, this week we welcome back to the program MEI Senior Fellow Paul Salem. Paul previously served as the Institute's president and CEO and as vice president for international engagement. His research focuses on political change, democracy and governance, social and economic policy, as well as regional and international relations in the Middle East.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Paul, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you back on Middle East Focus.
Thank you, Alistair and Matt. Pleasure to be with you.
So, Paul, you live in Beirut. Can you briefly give our listeners a sense of what things are like in Lebanon economically, politically, and on the security front? And how much does this compare to, say, the situation at the end of last year?
Well, I would say that the beginning of this year brought a lot of hope to Lebanon with the election of a new president who came in with a strong sort of presidential statement, and the nomination of Mr. Nawaf Salem, who was the head of the International Court of Justice, very well-respected person. He formed a highly qualified cabinet. Both the president and the cabinet are very sovereigntist in the sense that they're very committed to rebuilding Lebanon's sovereignty, and they're both very strongly reform-oriented, and both from outside the traditional militia and political party groups that dominated the country for the past 3 decades. This came on the heels of the devastation of Hizballah in 2024. Hizballah had pretty much dominated Lebanon for the past couple of decades. And also with the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, the Assad regime had cast a long shadow over Lebanon for the last half century. So a tremendous number of major changes, new leadership, and a large amount of hope. But as you indicated in your introduction, certainly a lot of challenges as well.
Paul, one of the major issues on the minds of Lebanon watchers here in Washington is, of course, the fate of the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire agreement signed on November 27, 2024. Given what we saw with the Israeli airstrikes in southern Beirut on the eve of Eid last week, which targeted purported Hezbollah drone production facilities, can we actually say that the ceasefire is still holding?
Well, I mean, we never could say that. The cessation of hostilities agreement, as it's officially called, which was entered into in late November, called for a cessation of hostilities from both sides. Israel, however, signed a separate letter with the Americans, enabling it to continue to target Hezbollah targets as it saw fit or as it saw the need to, or what they perceive as a threat. That has effectively meant that the ceasefire has been from one side only. Hezbollah indeed has pretty much ceased its fire. Since late November, it has cooperated in the handing over of its weapons in one part of the country, south of the Litani River, which is an area in South Lebanon. The agreement, however, as well as the presidential and government statements on the Lebanese side, call basically for a complete handover of weapons of Hezbollah from the entire part of the country. That Hezbollah has not yet gone along with. So the ceasefire pretty much has been from one side only. Israelis have continued to strike at will. The Israelis also, in violation of the ceasefire, have not withdrawn from all of the territory of Lebanon, which was one of the first conditions of the cessation of hostilities. Rather, they've maintained occupation of 5 points in certain border areas inside Lebanon. That's been a sticking point as well.
What do you think it would take to get Israel to honor the terms of the November agreement?
I mean, certainly Hezbollah is still armed. Some of it is south of the Litani, but that is being taken care of, and one shouldn't note that this disarmament process is being undertaken very closely with United States military through the U.S. Central Command. The committee that oversees this disarmament is based in Lebanon, and it's headed by U.S. military personnel. So the U.S. is very much on the ground, engaged with the Lebanese army in this disarmament process. And they will tell you that the disarmament process south of the Litani, which is the core of the cessation agreement, that is going very well. It's not complete yet, but it is 80 to 85% done. The other part of the agreement relates to areas north of the Litani that is not taking place. And Israel has not made it clear, which terms it's going to stick to. Certainly maintaining occupation in those 5 points is nowhere in any agreement. And the side letter that Israel signed with the United States, Lebanon is not a party to that letter, so nobody really knows exactly what it says. But the situation requires, on one hand, more effort from the Lebanese side to complete the task of disarming Hizballah both south of the Litani and north of the Litani, and we can talk about that. But it also requires, I think, more pressure from the U.S. on Israel to abide by its side of the cessation of hostilities agreement.
I want to ask as well, Paul, about the people from the south that were displaced by the fighting last year. Have they been able to return and begin to rebuild since the agreement was signed?
Well, I would say they've pretty much all returned to their towns and villages. Many of these towns and villages are piles of rubble, and people have set up, when they've had parts of their houses still functioning, they've set up house in those parts. Where there's nothing left, they've set up tents to be on, their homes and lands. So they've demonstrated that they will not leave those territories. They will return to them. They've had small handouts, sometimes from Hizballah. The government is trying to get some limited, at least, aid to them through the World Bank and other sources. But it's very clear that the major assistance for actual reconstruction, which will require about $6 billion, that will not be forthcoming from the regional community, mainly from the Gulf countries and the international community, until there's much more progress on disarming Hizballah.
So you've raised this rather critical element of the agreement, which is the disarmament question. As I believe you mentioned, in the south, Hezbollah is approximately 80 or so percent disarmed. But what about north of the Litani River? And how can Hezbollah be compelled toward disarmament there? What's the process that needs to be put in place?
That is a very good question. So far, the process that has been taking place in the south has been mutually agreed and done cooperatively between Hezbollah and the Lebanese armed forces, and one should say the United Nations forces, which are there, although occasionally they're being obstructed. But generally, it's been in cooperation with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah does not dispute that part of the agreement south of the Litani. They are disputing the part north of the Litani, and they say that they are not abiding by the implied necessity of them to disarm north of the Litani, whereas the government and the state has said, yes, you do. The president of the republic has said that he wants to proceed with the disarmament of Hezbollah through political means, mutually agreed, through negotiation. He does not want to resort to the use of force. But increasingly, Hezbollah has again and again said they do not want to disarm north, and they will not disarm north of the Litani. Now, it's worth pausing there for a minute to say, is that really the case? Is that a negotiating position? Is that an opening position? Are they trying to get something in exchange for those arms? Are they waiting for a signal from Iran? We have to say that that is what they're saying, but I would also say that that might not be the final word on the matter, because they know at the same time that there will be no money for their constituency unless they disarm. And they know that if they do not disarm, Israel will disarm them, itself. So they really have nowhere to go, but they're playing hard to get so far. And from the president's point of view, it's very understandable that he would prefer to do this through political means, because trying to do it by force might risk civil unrest, some kind of civil, armed conflict of some kind, which certainly one would want to avoid.
Would the government be ready for that sort of scenario should a political solution be difficult or impossible to achieve?
I think the short answer would be no, that you have the government, you have the parliament, and you have the army. If the leadership of the Shiite community, which is led by two parties today, the Hizballah, which is represented in parliament and indirectly in government, and the Amal movement, which is again in parliament and indirectly in the government, if the leaders of the Shiite community, the parties, do not agree, then you have, a constitutional crisis, at least in the sense that, there's a major community that is not agreeing. Then you look at the army, both soldiers and officers, which is obviously an army that reflects the makeup of the country, and there's a lot, huge, large Shiite contingents, as it were, in the army and in the officer corps. If their leadership is not in agreement, how will they behave? So it's politically, to say the least, very fraught. But it is also the case that many people are saying, yeah, we understand that, maybe not a full-fledged like frontal assault, but at the same time, the army has to begin behaving like an army, and the state has to begin behaving like a state. And there's, steps that can be taken short of outright sort of confrontation that could say that this has got to happen one way or another.
Switching gears just a little bit, as the recent visit by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas underscored, Hezbollah is not the only non-state actor in Lebanon that needs to be disarmed. And during his visit, he and the Lebanese authorities had discussed the problem of armed Palestinian groups in refugee camps in Lebanon. Are we likely to see real headway on that front in the near term?
That's a very important point. Historically, Lebanon lost its sovereignty to the PLO back in 1969. So we're talking many decades ago, on the heels of the Cairo Agreement, which was imposed by General Nasser of Egypt on Lebanon back in 1969, and it signed away its sovereignty. And the state has not been able to recover that sovereignty since the late 60s. So this is why this historic moment is so huge. And yes, when the president and the government said that they will insist on the state recovering its monopoly over the use of arms, that implies Hezbollah, but it also implies the armed groups inside this Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And as you indicated, President Abbas came, and the government has announced a timeline for that disarmament process to start sometime in the next couple of weeks. That is very important as kind of an indicator that the state is serious about recovering its use of force. And it's also a signal to Hezbollah that, okay, we're starting with the Palestinians, but you're next. Recovering the arms from camps where the Fatah movement is, which President Abbas also leads, recovering arms from camps where the Fatah movement is dominant probably will go smoothly. But there are many other camps where Fatah has really no major presence, where it's either Hamas or Islamic Jihad or other radical Islamist groups are present, and they have not necessarily indicated that they're going to go along with this. So how the state and the army deals with those camps is yet to be seen.
Pivoting from the issue of disarmament to kind of circle back and touch on the new government and how it's performed so far. They're past the 100-day mark. They're nearing the 6-month mark later this summer. Broad brushstrokes, what have they accomplished so far, and what are the authorities presently focused on? What do you see as the biggest challenges facing them right now?
A number of things. As I maybe indicated in my early remarks, it's been very important that the president and the prime minister and the government have been selected in a way that, it was not dictated by Iran or Syria or Hezbollah. That has not been the case for the past 30 years. So this is, it's quite momentous. It's also the case that, according to myself and many other people, these are very high integrity, very nationalistic, very clean, very capable leaders. And just having clean, nationalistic, capable, not corrupt leaders is new for Lebanon and is quite a step forward. So those are not to be forgotten as gains. The government itself has focused, I'd say, on three major issues. One is the issue of sovereignty and disarmament, which we already discussed, and which is largely led by the president, although in cooperation with the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Interior, who are members, of course, also of the cabinet. The other issue that the prime minister and the government have focused on is restocking the state. This state has been in free fall for, certainly the last 6 years, but even rife with corruption and all kinds of things for the last 30 years. So they've gone on a spree of finding, hiring, appointing the best Lebanese they can find in the country or anywhere in the world to put them in key positions in the government, in the public agencies, soon in the diplomatic corps, simply restocking this state with the best people. That's very important in the short and in the long run. A third file that they've been very focused on, and I wouldn't call it the third file, but just, in no particular order, is urgently addressing the multi-layer public finance, monetary, and banking collapse that Lebanon suffered from 2019 up till today, which has led to the loss of $70 billion of people's savings, collapse of the national currency, and so on. And they've been working very, very intensely in cooperation with the IMF to draft and try to pass 3 key laws that would transform the sector. One they've already passed, or the parliament has already passed, which is lifting banking secrecy in order to allow audits. The second is a law to allow the restructuring of the banking system. And the third is a law to apportion or provide the parameters to apportion the losses of the $70 billion that was lost between responsibilities of the state itself, responsibilities of the central bank, responsibility of the plethora of private banks, and what haircuts or what losses might accrue to some depositors within that 70 billion. So they're busy with a lot of things. And I'll end with saying, particularly because the prime minister is a lawyer and is a former judge, he's given particular importance to strengthening the judiciary and making it an independent and effective branch of government.
What's the public response been like to the government's early actions?
I would say the election of the president, the nomination of the prime minister, this is early on in sort of January, was greeted with a lot of euphoria in a large cross-section of the country. Let's be clear that Lebanon is quite divided. Hizballah and its supporters certainly did not welcome the fact that Hizballah has become much weaker. Hezbollah and its supporters certainly did not welcome the collapse of the Assad regime. So you're talking about different public audiences. But I would say the majority is on the camp that greatly welcomed the president, the prime minister. There were some complaints about how the government itself was formed because Hezbollah and the Amal movement indirectly were brought back into government. And that was seen as somewhat controversial. What has transpired in the meantime is it's become hard to actually gauge honest public opinion, if I can call it that, because there are enormous moneyed sectors who stand to win or lose a lot, depending on how the audits on their banks turn out, how the apportionment of losses is managed. Keep in mind, these moneyed classes, through their allies in parliament and in the political parties, used to more or less run the country. So now having independent people in government makes them very nervous. So they've gone ahead, some of these moneyed classes, and bought up, or let's say rented out, the main media outlets in the country, flooding social media with financial support to a certain direction. So they're really manipulating public opinion to the degree that it's hard to tell, what's genuine and what's not.
Paul, in our remaining time that we have today, could we turn to Lebanon's foreign relations? Because among other things, these certainly have implications both for the Lebanese government's crisis recovery plans, but also for the country's reassertion of its sovereignty. So on the United States, what are the major priorities for the U.S. on Lebanon now, and how does Lebanon fit into the administration's broader regional policy?
Well, the U.S. has always been very engaged in Lebanon, even when Syria and Iran were engaged. It never gave up on Lebanon. It remained the main supporter of the Lebanese army, the main supporter of many programs inside the country. It maintained and continued to build a massive embassy in the country. So they've never let it go. And now they have more influence than they had before, given the collapse of the Assad regime and the distancing of Iran. In terms of U.S. policy, their interest is in a Lebanon that stands up on its own 2 feet and is a normal, safe, secure, and healthy functioning member of the Middle East community. Lebanon has always been friendly to the U.S. and a friend and a partner, but it's also been a basket case for very long. So they'd prefer it to be a friend and a partner that's standing on its own feet, that's securing its borders, that's safe, that's not harboring, obviously, any terrorist groups, that is not projecting threats to other countries, particularly Israel, but also others in the region. So that's kind of where they want it to be. I think that happens to coincide with what a lot of Lebanese want: a functioning state, secure borders, healthy economy, friendly to the U.S., friendly to the Arab countries, particularly in the Gulf, part of the international community. I don't think that's changed very much in recent terms. I would say that there is an interest on the U.S. side and certainly in the region with the issue of Lebanese-Israeli relations. Part of that is ending the war, disarming Hizballah, establishing the ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities. The U.S. previous to the war had helped Lebanon and Israel demarcate their maritime borders. The U.S. is currently trying to help Lebanon and Israel demarcate their land borders. So the U.S. certainly wants Lebanon and Israel at a minimum to get to a situation of calm and security across the border. But also now there's the ambition for Lebanon eventually or at some point to join the Abraham Accords with other countries, some other countries in the region. My assessment is that wouldn't be possible if we can get past the current crisis if Saudi Arabia goes first, which means if Saudi Arabia finds there are enough conditions for it to normalize with Israel, which would require concessions for the Palestinians. If Saudi goes, then I think both Syria and Lebanon would be in a position potentially to go as well.
How closely aligned is U.S. policy with France, which, of course, another Western country with a long history of very deep ties with Lebanon?
I would say they're generally aligned. There was some distance occasionally. The French were a bit more forward-leaning in terms of engagement with the Assad regime, but that's now in the past. They certainly want to be forwardly engaged with the new regime in Damascus. For a while, the U.S. was standing back, but President Trump has now effectively chosen engagement as well. So I think they're back on the same page there. I think France looks at Lebanon and Syria with a bit more of a focus on its commercial interests, getting, a shipping contract here and a trade contract there. I think the U.S., its economic interests are at a higher level. They might be interested in a contract here and there, the Americans, but that's not why they're doing what they're doing. I think the French have a historic relationship with Lebanon and with Syria, but also they have economic interests that are worth more to them in the bigger picture than to the U.S.
We've mentioned Syria a few times here, but wanted to follow up on that in a little bit more detail. Damascus-Beirut ties have gone through a major reorientation since the fall of the Assad regime last December. Where do things stand roughly 6 months on, and how is that dynamic evolving going forward?
Well, it certainly obviously was a tremendous change having the Assad regime, which dominated the country for more than 50 years. The Assad regime and the Ba'ath Party had an official position that Lebanon and Lebanon's borders were not legitimate. So that's a pretty bad starting point for relations between two countries, and that luckily, at least as a position, is gone. As I indicated, different parties in Lebanon, some welcomed the arrival, the fall of the Assad regime. I would say a majority did, but certainly Hizballah and many of its allies did not. The relations, I think, have gone off to a good start. The Prime Minister visited with President Shara in Damascus. The Prime Minister also met with the Syrian Foreign Minister in the Arab Summit in Baghdad. The President has not yet gone to Damascus, the Lebanese President, nor has the Syrian government sent any of its high representatives to Lebanon. Potentially, the stabilization of Syria, the opening up of the Syrian economy would be a historic boon for Lebanon. Lebanon has suffered from Syrian oppression for 5 decades, and when the Syrian economy collapsed and then basically came under sanctions, that also choked off the Lebanese economy because it's the only land route for Lebanon to the Arab interior. So Lebanon has a lot to gain from Syria's unity, Syria's success, and Syria's economic reconstruction, a lot to gain. But there are problems between the two sides. On the Lebanese side, the Lebanese are eager to return or encourage the return of 1.5 to 2 million Syrians that are in Lebanon as refugees. Many of them are under the guise of refugees, but they're actually workers and whatnot. That's a big burden for Lebanon to carry, but conditions in Syria are not yet positive enough for all of those to go back, so that's a sticking point. On the Syrian side, there are a number of sticking points. Syria considers that some members of Hizballah and some members of the old Assad regime that are in Lebanon are orchestrating attacks on the Syrian government. They accuse those groups of orchestrating the attacks on the coast a few months ago, and they still see those groups operating inside Lebanon as being directly a threat to them and their new government. So there's that. There are a number of Islamist Syrian prisoners in Lebanese jails, which the regime in Syria or the new government in Syria wants released and returned to them. They don't have a high level of trust in the Lebanese security services, much of which have had years previously of cooperation with the Assad regime and with Hezbollah and so on. So there's a lot of, I would say, caution, to put it mildly, on the Syrian side. Also, the Lebanese-Syrian border used to be an open border which Hezbollah and the Assad regime used to smuggle weapons, smuggle drugs, smuggle all kinds of things. And both the Lebanese government and the Syrian government have been trying to put an end to that, but it's not been easy, and the efforts are ongoing. I would say that both governments are trying to improve those relations and address those issues. But I would also say that Lebanon and Syria would and should welcome help from the Arab countries and the U.S. to make sure that these two countries, Syria and Lebanon, do fix their relationships and take off together rather than take off on opposite ends of an issue.
Do you think the recent shift in U.S. policy on Syria is likely to have sort of knock-on effects for Lebanon in terms of paving the way for the return of more of the refugees or helping to unlock some of that much-needed investment in regional infrastructure and kind of rebuilding and recovering in the lot more generally?
Yeah, I think the announcement of the listing of U.S. sanctions was the second biggest thing to affect Syria since the fall of the Assad regime. And yes, absolutely, it is a game changer. First of all, it indicates that the U.S., ideally will continue engaging with the new government in Syria, along with Arab countries, Turkey and Europeans, to make sure it progresses, to work towards the unity of Syria, to make sure that the new government in Syria doesn't slip back into radical Islamism or something dangerous like that. So as a political signal, it is very promising for the Syrians and for the Lebanese. And certainly as an economic pathway, there was nothing really major that could be done in Syria while those sanctions were in place. So now this gives a signal to investors all over to begin thinking of serious investment in Syria, to give them confidence. Of course, the actual removal of sanctions takes time and it's complicated, but a very, very positive sign. And Lebanon and Syria as economies have been joined at the hip for centuries. It's not new. So yes, if the Syrian economy takes off, Lebanon will as well, and they will benefit from each other's economies.
We certainly can't avoid speaking about the other big elephant in the room, which is Iran. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi visited Beirut last week, and he vowed that Iran wanted, quote, a new page in relations with Lebanon based on mutual respect and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. What was your read on his visit? And is Tehran adopting a new approach to the Levant, or is it just playing for time while it negotiates with Washington?
I do not think the visit indicated any major shift in terms of Iranian policy in the region or in Lebanon. The shift is more reality on the ground that Hezbollah 2 years ago used to be a major local and regional military force. It is absolutely no longer the case. So the change has come from the facts on the ground, largely imposed by Israel, not a change of policy from Iran. The visit, I think, was part of a bit of flexing of diplomatic muscle. It was linked to President Sisi's invitation to the Iranian foreign minister to visit Egypt. And that was because President Sisi felt left out of the summit with President Trump. Saudi Arabia did not invite him. So he was kind of flexing his diplomatic muscle, say, hey, I can talk to Iran. And I think Iran was showing a bit of, diplomatic presence and showing that it could show up in Beirut, despite the fact that Hezbollah has been hit hard and it still needs to be talked to. But the fact of the matter is that Hezbollah is really largely leaderless right now. And most of the calls about Hezbollah really being guided by, the Iranian embassy in Lebanon and by the Revolutionary Guards. The major weaponry that is in Lebanon is Iranian weaponry. It's stationed in Lebanon for use by Hezbollah, but it's part of, Iranian equipment. And the fact of the matter is that if Iran instructed Hezbollah to disarm, it would do so. And it's clear that Iran is not instructing Hezbollah to disarm. And by saying, we don't get involved, that basically means we're not asking them to do what, the international agreements between Lebanon and Israel have said it should do. And I think they're playing not only for time to see maybe what they could get out of a deal with the U.S., but also playing the long game, that if they can keep some of Hezbollah's weapons, why not? If they can avoid full disarmament, why not play for that as well? And sadly, they've shown that they're willing to fight to the last Lebanese, the last Palestinian, the last Yemeni. They wouldn't risk the same thing on their soil for their people.
What about for the Lebanese themselves? As far as they're concerned, is there any going back to the status quo ante with the relationship with Iran?
No, I mean, maybe it's not up to the Lebanese. That status quo is for, in all likelihood, not coming back, mainly because Iran is not coming back to Syria. Now, there is a scenario where it does come back to Syria. In other words, if Syria falls apart and if the government is not able to build unity in Syria, it is possible that Syria falls back or goes deeper into separate armed groups and, areas of influence, and would not be far-fetched at that point over the years for Iran to find a way back maybe to the Syrian coast and to hook up again with Hezbollah through the Bekaa and through the Syrian coast. So that's why it's very important for Syria to succeed and for that unity to be achieved, because that's the guarantee for Lebanon that Iran cannot come back through Syria, and that's the guarantee that Hezbollah cannot be rearmed, and that the Lebanese state has a good chance of rebuilding sovereignty.
Finally, Paul, we wanted to touch on Saudi Arabia, which was instrumental in creating the political conditions to allow for the election of President Aoun and the formation of the new government. What role do you expect Riyadh to play in supporting Lebanon's recovery and reform efforts going forward?
Well, the kingdom has been very supportive, as you said, of the political change in Lebanon, encouraging the election of President Joseph Aoun and then encouraging the nomination of Prime Minister Nawaf Salem, very supportive of the government that he formed. And that continued support from Saudi Arabia and the U.S. and other Gulf countries and Europe is what gives the president and the government their momentum, because the parliament that's in place is a parliament that was elected 3 years ago when Hezbollah and Iran were still very dominant. So the parliament reflects an old Lebanon, whereas the president and the government reflect a new Lebanon. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there. But Saudi Arabia and other countries have said, look, we've given you the support. You're in place to do what needs to be done. Now you have to do what you need to do, which is disarm the Palestinians and Hezbollah, impose the authority of the state of the Lebanese army, undertake the economic reforms to build accountability and transparency, strengthen the judiciary. And if by the end of the year we've seen that you've done a lot on all of these files, then yes, you can count on us to begin to provide serious support for reconstruction, begin thinking of investment, support, for the Lebanese economy, investment in the Lebanese economy. But the homework and the work now has to be done on the Lebanese side. They are supportive, but they're hanging back to see if the state will succeed or if it will stumble.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in our conversation here today, but before we wrap up, I wanted to get your kind of concluding thoughts, your outlook on the situation moving forward. What do you expect to see in the coming months?
I think most importantly, in the long term, I'm quite optimistic. The country might not be able to achieve all the things it wants to achieve in the next 5 months. Disarming the Palestinians, disarming Hizballah, reforming the banking system, strengthening the judiciary. That's a lot to do for a state which is quite, it's rather bankrupt, has no resources, it's weak. So maybe the achievements in the calendar year will be modest. But if Syria continues to go in the direction of a successful, better governed state and a state that is cooperating closely with our friends in the Gulf and with the US and in Europe, then willy-nilly, Lebanon will be in an environment where it too, where Hezbollah no longer has a future, where Lebanon too has to move in that same direction. Because when you look at Syria, Syria too they might not be able to achieve much in the next 5-6 months, but in the long term, I'm optimistic about their future. It's important to note that there are parliamentary elections in Lebanon next May. So the current government has a timeline that ends next May, because when there are parliamentary elections, the government changes, and it is rushing to achieve, as much as it can on the sovereignty issue, on building the judiciary, building up the state, and undertaking the major economic reforms to put Lebanon at least on the right, give it the right infrastructure to begin taking off after the next parliamentary elections and when the next government takes over in the spring.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you very much, Paul, for joining us on the program today.
Thank you both.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Lebanon and the wider Levant, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Chekai. We hope you'll listen in again next week.